Welcome and thank you for joining today's online interactive salon. This is Yvonne Ng and I'm the Annual Giving and Donor Relations Officer for MIT Open Learning. And today we're going to discuss creativity and learning for the 21st century. The session will be hosted by Professor Sanjay Sarma, our Vice President for Open Learning, and we'll hear from Professor D. Fox Harrell, the Director of the MIT Center for Advanced Virtuality. And so there are a couple of notes before we begin. This salon is being recorded and will be shared with the open learning community. Your participation today indicates your willingness to share your likeness and any comments you make in this recording. To ask a question, please type it into the chat box and I'll queue it up for the speakers. Now, without further ado, Professor Sarma and Harrell.
Hello, welcome again. It is a great pleasure for me to participate in this event with my dear friend and colleague, Professor Fox Harrell. Fox and I have been discussing many of the questions that will come up today, and I look forward to an engaging discussion. But particularly, we've been working, and he has led the creation of a new center at MIT, the Center for Advanced Virtuality. I am Sanjay Sarma. I am Vice President for Open Learning at MIT. And maybe we'll kick things off by me talking a little bit about some of the philosophical underpinnings of what the Office of Open Learning does. The MIT motto is mens et manus, mind and hand. It was established in 1861 before the Civil War broke out. The first students came to MIT in 1865. In many ways, the establishment of MIT was itself revolutionary because the word technology was only about 20, 30 years old when MIT was established. So in many ways, MIT was the first high-tech endeavor in the world. The other interesting note today is that everyone talks about maker and hands-on. Mens et manus encapsulates hands-on, I think, more eloquently than anything we've done since. In fact, the traditional MIT logo has the shield has one person holding a book and a person on the other side of a podium holding a sledgehammer. It turns out that if you look at the science of learning and what we've learned about cognitive psychology, that was remarkably prescient in many respects. And so for the next few minutes, just 5 minutes, I'd like to talk about that. Let's talk about the importance of curiosity first. There's a great quote from, we don't know who, it's probably Pliny is the earliest person this is attributed to, which is, the mind is not a vessel to be filled, it is a fire to be kindled. And so for over 2,000 years, we've known that it is not that we professors, the two of us here, hold some sort of pen and the student is merely a piece of paper, the student's mind, and you can just write on it. That's a bit of a fallacy, actually, that's become prevalent in education over the last 200 years because it was convenient to assume that students could just be sat down and professors could write on their heads. And if they didn't absorb stuff or if they weren't paying attention, you could wag a finger at them and say, do better next time. What the science tells us is quite the opposite. It is a fire to be kindled. In other words, curiosity is what drives much of learning, and I want to spend a minute on that. So a colleague of ours here at MIT, the director of a new center that was established in our office called the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, mightily, John Gabrielli, did some remarkable research a few years ago where he and his colleagues, they put EEG monitors, which I assure you are non-invasive, they just sit on the head, and they monitored students' brain waves as they learned something. What they found was there was a remarkably repeatable pattern of brain waves that correlated to good learning, and was fascinating. They wrote a wonderful paper about it, and there the work rested for a couple of years. In and of itself, that's only half the answer to an unknown puzzle. Because what do you do with this information? So you know there are brainwaves that correspond to good learning, but how do you get someone into that state? And what is that state? So there was another research group in California which actually answered the question. And what they found was remarkable. What they found was two things. One, that state is what we in English refer to as curiosity. So curiosity is the equivalent to hunger. Curiosity is hunger for knowledge, hunger for learning. Now, when you're hungry, something happens in your body. Saliva starts flowing, the body prepares. It turns out the equivalent for saliva in the brain is dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. And there's a circuit, the dopamine circuit gets activated. And so we now know that it is not about getting students to sit down and listen to a professor. It is more about getting a student to care about the material and become hungry for it. And we've known this sort of philosophically for a long time. We now know it somewhat scientifically. But for the last 200 years, the bulldozer of dogma has plowed over any such impracticalities because it's simply, we just didn't know how to do it. But you all remember your favorite teacher, whether it's a science teacher or a history teacher, they probably made you curious. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, which is curiosity. The second thing I want to talk about is the power of doing things with your hands. Mens et manus, mind and hand. And the interesting thing there is that, and of course that's all the rage now with things like the Raspberry Pi, 3D printing, et cetera, the maker community, the maker movement. But the interesting thing there is in fact a basis in cognitive science for that as well. There is some excellent work that came out of a professor who was at the University of Chicago, Shan Bialak. She's actually now, I think, the president of Barnard College. They did this tremendous thing where they worked on getting students to both learn just purely abstractly, but also learn by doing things with their hands. For example, if you learn about angular momentum, you can listen to it for 2 hours, you can listen to it for 90 minutes, and for 30 minutes you can play with a spinning bicycle wheel. Suddenly you can feel the torques. As you try and torque it one way, you get the gyroscopic effect. And what they found was that students who learn the second way learn better. It's more durable, etc. And the theory, this is called embodied cognition, by the way, something Fox knows a lot about. And the theory is that this is because the motor part of the brain, the part of the brain that deals with motion, gets woken up, and that reinforces learning. Now, where does this all lead? When we were doing open learning at MIT, we realized that open learning is online, obviously, and you can only do so much online. We realized that hands-on is what happens on campus at MIT, and you can't do that online, at least today. But can you sort of move in that direction? Can you give people immersion into worlds that they can't afford, they can't be at, or perhaps even don't exist? And it's that thinking that led us to, on the one hand, create the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, which looked at the science and the economics, the fundamentals of learning. But then, with Fox, it led us to hatching this new Center for Advanced Virtuality, CAV, which looks at how virtuality, in all its glorious forms, not just using 3D headsets, can be leveraged, exploited, to really make a telling impact on students so that they learn, they're enriched, and so on. So these are two of the points I want to talk about. Maybe I'll end by saying that the Office of Open Learning, what we want to do is really rethink the way in which learning occurs, use all the modalities that are available to us. Some of it is online, a lot of it is online, a lot more will be online, but we never want to forget the importance of individual, individuated, personal, in-person coaching. Unfortunately, that's not a luxury that a lot of humanity can avail of, but for those who can, we have really no doubts, no compunctions about saying that is the essence. The problem today in the classroom is that we spend too much time in one-to-many sort of broadcast mode and too little time doing the hands-on, the curious stuff that makes learning exciting. And flipping the classroom, blended learning, is an attempt to displace the one-to-many listen-only mode of lecturing, and to reintroduce some of the hands-on learning, reintroduce the magic of curiosity, and make the whole learning environment much more exciting. So with that, I'll turn to my colleague Fox, and Fox is going to present his views on these questions. Fox.
All right, thanks, Sanjay, for the wonderful introduction and the insightful words. It actually makes me think this idea about learning not just being a matter of filling an empty vessel. That's actually one idea that the learning sciences have begun to critique quite a bit. That's what we call the banking model, where you just deposit knowledge into students' heads. Actually, what we are trying to do with the Center for Advanced Virtuality is not only engage topics such as skill mastery, knowledge acquisition, and tool use. That's a kind of traditional side, but also your identity, to see yourself as a learner and doer, the discourse, to communicate like someone in that subject matter, and then also affect. That is, you should be engaged and emotionally charged, that is curious about what you're learning. So I think everything Sanjay said is quite in line with the latest in the learning sciences, as he mentioned. So I'm Professor Fox Harrell, as was mentioned. I'm both in the Computer Science and AI Lab, as well as Comparative Media Studies here at MIT. And most recently, as was also mentioned, I've been directing the Center for Advanced Virtuality. So the aim with the Center for Advanced Virtuality is to pioneer innovative experiences using technologies of virtuality. So what are technologies of virtuality? Why don't we just say VR or augmented reality? Well, really, we're looking at any computing system that constructs imaginative experiences that are blended with the physical world. So certainly VR systems do this, but we're looking much further afield, as I'll mention in just a few minutes. So we have a growing team. We have a number of staff, affiliates, researchers, students. Most recently, Francesca Panetta joined us. She was a former director of VR for The Guardian newspaper in the UK, and PhD students from CSAIL, research affiliates from across campus, and they're all engaged in the endeavor that I just mentioned. I want to say a bit about the structure of the center. There are 4 central functions of the Center for Advanced Virtuality, or MIT Virtuality for short. These are the studio, lab, salon, and hub. The studio aspect, that's focused on making, that is expression and innovation. Next, we have the lab. That's the research component. We need to make sure these systems are empirically doing what we say they're doing, to measure learning gains, to measure reflection, and to ensure that there's good cognitive science behind what we're doing. The salon, that's focused on sharing. That's events, capacity building across MIT, supporting the student clubs, bringing in undergraduate researchers to work with us. And then finally, the hub is just catalyzing that mission even further. That is focusing on student involvement across campus and the shared resources so that any student from across campus can become involved in these kind of aims. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, why don't we say just VR or AR? Is it just about headsets? Well, actually, we're interested in a range of different kind of technologies. Most recently, we've done work using AI technologies to, for example, create a video that helps to make people more aware of technologies of misinformation. We've also done work using AI to personalize experiences. So our aim is to go beyond just the headsets. We certainly include the headset, but we want to use AI and other technologies to make these experiences adaptive. So our approach then to engineering and creative practices aim to push the expressive potential of technologies of virtuality. We aim to simulate social and cognitive phenomena, and then most importantly, and this has been a major initiative both in open learning, the new college computing, and within MIT generally, is we always consider the social and cultural impact of what we are building. We've designed a range of learning systems. I've been doing this work here now for about 10 years, and systems that address social issues. For example, modeling everyday covert discrimination, sociological issues such as issues like gatekeeping and access and democratizing education, modeling user preferences and customizing experiences, modeling reflection and learning. For example, a system we collaborated with JWell in open learning to build a system that educates users about sexism within the workplace. And we not only measure the completion rate, we actually measure, did people learn, did they reflect, did their perspectives transform? Racial and ethnic socialization within the classrooms. This is the kind of access and equity piece. A lot of systems model only what you look like in a virtual world. That is, if you look like a woman in STEM, is your experience different? We actually model how you think about the subject matter. That is, if you think about race in the sense that you're colorblind, that there's no kind of issues around this, or the other extreme, you think that there's rampant discrimination, you will see the exact same scenario that takes place in the classroom very differently. So we actually model the mindset around these topics and then transform VR experiences based on those mindsets, not just what you look like. So today I'll focus just briefly on two particular projects since we've had a special initiative this past semester related to museums and informal learning spaces. So one project that gives a sense of the kind of things that we can do is The Enemy, which you could say is using VR for peace. This is about humanizing the other in the face of war. So I worked with Kareem Ben Khalifa. I wrote a grant to bring him here as a visiting artist, and I was a human-computer interaction producer on this project. This is a large-scale VR work that's been shown in a Tribeca Film Festival. It won the Rose d'Or Award. That's the equivalent of the Emmy Award within Europe. But more than that, the aim is really to find what impact we can have on visitors. It's large-scale, 15 people going through at a time, which is uncommon for a VR work. You see the other people who are there with you, and the system is measuring your body language as proxies for your nervousness, your bias, your engagement, and so on. It's been written up in a lot of the major places, but I want to give just a sense of what the system looks like. So as you enter into the virtual space, you see combatants on either side, from major conflicts, Congo, El Salvador, with gangs of El Salvador, and Gaza. It's personalized, that is, you experience the conflict that you know most about last, so you can find what are the kind of general parallels. There's an AR version. We also give you information about the context of the conflict. The soldiers are asked basic human questions. Why do you fight? Have you killed before? What is war for you? What is peace for you? And where do you see yourself in 10 years? And what emerges is actually there are many more similarities than there are differences on either side. I'll show just a very, very brief excerpt from a trailer so you can get a sense of the work.
The project is rooted in my experience as a war photographer, going from one side of the front line to the other, and finding that the fighters' dreams, hopes, and nightmares are often more similar than they are different. So there is a bigger story than the war itself, and this is the one I want to explore and share. For The Enemy, I am using the latest technologies in virtual and augmented realities, so you can engage directly with the combatants and meet them, hear them, and feel them the way I did. In many parts of our worlds, you create an enemy as a kid without having met your enemy, because the society around you has created an enemy in the other. So the question is, could I be you if I was on the other side?
And I'll briefly just say here that with this work, the part that I contributed was the underlying model of interaction within the narrative. That is, as you go through the experience, if you're very nervous, then the cloud cover comes in, everything becomes darker, you're getting ambient feedback. If you're very attentive, the light comes back out. If you pay more attention to one than the other, the system knows enough to call you out for that, to say, I noticed you listened more to one soldier than the other. And at the very end, you see yourself in a virtual mirror, in a space for debriefing, for reflection, but it's not you. As you move, you realize that moving along with you is one of the soldiers. And that is the soldier you were least comfortable with. That is, if you were raised like your enemy, you could be your enemy. Yeah, so I'll mention just one more project for today of a very different sort in a sense, but at the same time as The Enemy was shown for a number of months, largest scale exhibition for VR and maybe the first at the MIT Museum. This is a collaboration with the Universal HipHop Museum, which is opening in New York City. So what we did was to create a personalized museum experience. The aim was to use conversational AI and our personalization model so that anyone could go to learn about the history of this particular art form and its impacts. So we created, I worked with top Afrofuturist artists and professors from the Hutchins Center over at Harvard, and then also John Jennings, who is at University of California, Riverside, best-selling authors to create custom imagery that is characters that represent the 5 elements of hip-hop culture. These are MCing, DJing, breakdancing, aerosol art, and knowledge. Knowledge of self, knowledge of history, knowledge of culture. The aim was then to use conversational AI that these adaptive characters could elicit your own preferences in music, whether you like country and western and campestral music, whether you like jazz and more kind of artsy or sophisticated kind of sounds in terms of the harmonic structure. Then we can give you a custom experience. We also ask you about lyrics that will get at what issues do you want to learn about. Do you want to learn about the role of women within hip hop, how they've been represented, how they self-represent? Do you want to learn about the cultural impacts globally of the hip hop music and culture? Do you want to learn about the connection to commerce? Right, so you can get any of those and a custom soundtrack based on your own playlist that no matter what will blend your taste with what the system has to offer. The most recent project, we've been focused on another kind of informal learning. This won the Creative Technology and Digital Storytelling Award at IDFA, the top documentary film festival globally. More than that, we're doing research to make sure that people have learned from this system. The aim here is around the global issue of misinformation. Oftentimes people associate AI with misinformation. Here we're turning the lens around. We're saying, can we use AI technologies to create a more discerning public around misinformation? So the system creates a documentary that's an alternate history documentary that is what would happen if the moon landing had been unsuccessful. And so there's a speech that Richard Nixon would have given, a very poignant speech written by Bill Sapphire, that we actually created a deep fake of Richard Nixon giving this, but it's staged within the 1960s living room where you have a newspaper that explains how it was made, what deep fakes are, and why they're an issue that we should care about. So again, the aim is really so that the public can understand, short of digital forensics and other techniques, the public can educate ourselves about this technology. So this is a very brief trailer about the work.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Your 1201 alarm. We're going at alarm.
Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. Good night.
So if you read the Boston Globe even just this past Sunday, you will have read about this work. So to conclude, I just scratched the surface of the kind of aims that we have in informal and museum spaces. This kind of work aims to both engineer and engage with creative practice to push the expressive potential of technologies of virtuality, our work show in the top artistic festivals, as well as presenting the research at the major computer science conferences too. We simulate social and cognitive phenomena, and we intrinsically consider the social and cultural impact of the work and empirically measure to make sure that we're making that impact that we're aiming for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fox. That was very inspiring. I have to say that I've seen that Nixon speech before. It's a beautiful speech, very poignant, but the deepfake gives you goosebumps. Well, look, there's so many things we can talk about here, but some questions have come in already and some pre-prepared. let me just kick things off by saying, what is the impact, what is the future of digital learning and virtual experiences in things like museums, galleries, after school, et cetera?
Right, so I think there are a number of possibilities that we have for using this technology. One, of course, is democratizing access and reach, but I think that's only scratching the surface because we actually want to leverage the pedagogical gains of these kind of technologies. So I mentioned some of those kind of gains. Those include merging skill mastery, knowledge acquisition, and tool use with affective engagement, with seeing yourself as a learner and doer, and then also with practicing the communication and discourse. This means using virtual identities. So we did studies of over 10,000 users on what are the best practice using a virtual identity. That could be an online account, a social media profile, avatar within VR, and how do these impact your learning? For example, we were able to find that, so we looked at anthropomorphic, non-anthropomorphic, if it looks like you, doesn't look like you, how much effort you put into creating the avatar. And then we found conditions under which people are both more engaged and perform better. And sometimes they're very simple, but we're able to we're able to empirically show this. That is, if it looks like you when you're doing well and excelling, this is called the successful likeness condition, and otherwise you pop up encouragement, but you don't see that avatar, that's one of these best performing conditions. Also measuring perspective transformation, reflection, sociability, 21st century skills, not just the kind of banking vessel model of STEM learning. And then finally, personalized experiences. It's so crucial for democratizing access. That is, if you are a country western listener and you go to the HipHop Museum, we need to do the work to make the exhibit relevant to you. For myself, if I go to the Louvre and I see a Caravaggio, or I go to Crystal Bridges or to any of the kind of well-known museums, then we need to be able to see ourselves and our connection, whether that's our taste, our preferences, values, and so forth. And that's where we can blend AI and virtual technologies to make these experiences speak specifically to different users.
Your question about country western and hip hop begs the question, which I want to ask, but maybe you can answer later on, your opinions on Lil Nas and that whole question. But you've educated me a lot about this. I mean, the way I see it for a learner, it's like an obstacle course. You have to overcome all these obstacles. And the inequity arises because some people have fewer obstacles. They're fortunate, they're blessed. Some have more obstacles. You talked about this condition. Can you talk a little bit about things like stereotype, threat, and so on?
All right, sure. Yeah, so Stereotype Threat, this is well-known work by Steele and Abramson. That is if you are subject to stereotype in some field, for example, like young women entering into STEM, mathematics, computer science, et cetera, then if, for example, that stereotype is triggered, even just a checkbox for gender ahead of the SAT or the achievement test, they actually will perform down to that stereotype. It could be used in reverse too. People might perform up to a positive stereotype. But this issue, it's a major one in learning. Again, that's the kind of identity piece. At the same time as looking at these kind of challenges, though, I actually prefer to not take a deficit-oriented model, but to say that we can blend anyone's cultural interests, their background, with learning. And so, whereas some VR experiments will do things such as, well, then let's just give the woman a male avatar, and then that'll inoculate her against stereotype threat. We want to do a different kind of approach. We want to say that who you are should be a resource for learning in this domain. And so that's where we do things such as create a virtual experience that takes your own interests, it's in dialogue with who you are, and then create a simulation that can bring you into that learning domain. That's, again, the personalization piece. So although I do think that the equity piece is very important and looking at those kind of obstacles, I always like to say that people's backgrounds, and that it could include not just cultural background, racial, ethnic, or gender, their preferences, their personalities, and so forth, that's a resource for learning if we can just teach in the right way, and adaptive technologies can help with that process.
Great. I mean, which actually leads to the next question, which is, how can this help with equity-driven pathways?
Right. It's such a crucial question. So one of the ways that we can help with this, I think, is through creating systems that have awareness of social phenomena. So for example, with our system about sexism in the workplace, this was a collaboration with Workplace Learning in JWEL. We built an online...
maybe we should just clarify, JWEL is the Jameel World Education Lab at MIT. It's a sort of a playground for companies, countries, universities from around the world to work together in the Office of Open Learning and to work with colleagues like Fox on fundamental questions. And so Fox did some research with JWEL. Sorry.
Right. Thank you for adding to this. So in this work, we took the latest social science model of sexism that includes not just hostile sexism, that's the kind oft reported in Me Too movement, but also subtle forms of sexism that end up having impacts on anxiety, depression, mental health, and so on, and then create a simulation that looks like, it feels like a workplace, but you can play through those scenarios. It's a low stakes kind of environment. You can, and the system, it actually uses a patented technology of mine on the back end that tracks your categorization in any category. In this case, the types of sexism that you are displaying within the experience. We can change the outcomes based on this, or a number of different outcomes, but more importantly, it's embedded within online courseware where you can debrief about the experience afterwards, and we measure, did your perspective transform, did you reflect? That's along the lines of the human-computer interaction research in reflective engagement. So that's just one case where we actually take social science models and create AI simulations of those models for better understanding. At the same time, you can do that for STEM learning. It's not only for learning about those topics, make the adaptive experience support and mitigate against those kind of negative impacts. So for instance, we have a scenario where you have a young woman who's accused of cheating on an exam within VR. And within that experience, we're modeling racial ethnic socialization, how you've been trained to think about race, and then give students coping mechanisms. So if the teacher accuses you of cheating and you know that you didn't, then what's the appropriate way to respond to that kind of scenario for the best outcome for you? And this gives a chance where you can, again, play through in a safe space these kind of impediments to learning.
Right, that's very, very interesting. I have thoughts spinning in my head here, but I'll hold up and ask a different question, which maybe go in a different direction, which is, how can VR and immersive technologies in general be used to foster creative expression? And part A and part B is, can creativity be used to unleash learning, you know?
Sure, that's also a great question. So I think a part of it is that it's very traditional to see computing technologies, including VR, as instrumental and utilitarian. You know, that is, we have a problem, we're trying to solve it and do it in practical and efficient means. I mean, that's what we commonly do as engineers and here at MIT. Instead, we can actually look at the computer as a medium with its own characteristics. And then we think, how can we foster learning in a different way using this medium? That's when you begin to think about it more creatively. You know, that is, if in film you have the cut and the take and the dissolve and you know, the kind of vocabulary of film, in VR, for instance, you have direct address. That is, the system is measuring you. If your head moves or you move in the space, the system can respond directly to that. And you have intentional looking. That is, unlike a typical screen, we're actually measuring where your gaze is, where you're attending to in terms of the experience that you're having. So then you can begin to ask, how can we exploit that to create a more kind of interesting experience? That is, if someone looks here, looks away, now you can put something of interest right there, so when they look back, it's a kind of novel or surprising experience. That's just one example, but this is, mastering that vocabulary is one way we can do this. And I also think that using AI technologies in conjunction with virtuality technologies can allow us to change experiences in terms of, say, emotional tone, in terms of the metaphor. Different learners learn better through different metaphors. We can change in terms of cultural style. We can change in terms of theme, the same plot but different theme. And I feel like then you're beginning to think about how to leverage simulation and the technology for a new creative form. And then finally, you have to work along with the kind of institutions of cultural curation and showing, museums, art spaces, with popular culture. That's why on our advisory board we have people ranging from TV that measure the impact on social issues such as teen pregnancy and other kind of issues. We have a VP of Creative Technologies from Warner Brothers. We're looking really for how we can make an impact to access people with the technology, because it's not enough just to make it and keep it in the lab. We actually want to get the technology out where people can encounter it as new creative expressive forms, but they can also learn and transform and grow in their physical world selves and lives from these technologies too.
Do you think there's a, to consider, for example, a young person who is intimidated by the material, and in principle using, say, biometrics, right? Looking at the eye movement, for example, you could react to them, right? You could give them support. Is that around the corner? Is it far away? Are we doing some of that? What's the status?
We're actually doing some of that, and so I'll say two things. One is, besides reacting to people as consumers of the technology, it's also enabling them to be producers of the technology. Exactly. So that means making it accessible so people can create their own virtual experiences. So that's some of what we've been interested in too. When we work with the classrooms with the NSF grant, STEM plus computing grant, we're able to have a computer science learning system where students learn the basic principles of user interface design. They learn basic computer science principles, but they also saw themselves as learners and doers using our custom avatar system. Then those avatars inhabited games that they built on social issues that were of interest to them in their communities, whether that was school bullying, violence, or poverty, many different kind of issues. So I just wanted to mention that piece that I think is crucial, and for our MIT students to get involved in that process too. With the biometrics, we did this with work such as the Enemy project. We can also use other forms like electrodermal skin response. We can use approaches such as EEG. There's very unobtrusive EEG devices, facial expression. So there's a range of kind of inputs. The aim then is how do you, in some artful way, deploy those kind of inputs, and then moreover, incorporate them in a seamless way within the experience that doesn't just feel like a kind of a gimmick. And then finally use that also not just for changing the experience, but for measurement, so that afterwards then we can make sure that we're actually being effective with the work. So I think that is available. I mean, with facial recognition, with facial expression recognition, you could do that just using your laptop's camera. And electrodermal, I think, is around the corner. It's still a little bit costly for every day, but it certainly is something that, say, MIT students, for example, would be able to play with. We just always want to get a range of different types of users, from the high-end sets, but also a lot of mobile VR and work that would be accessible even to high school students.
That's really exciting. Do you, sometimes, I've been a professor for 23 years, and 24 years actually. I see students with different levels of self-efficacy and confidence. I mean, the basics are the same, right? The students are fantastic, but there's one student who has more self-efficacy and the other one who has less. And I imagine you could put them through exercises which would only be enabled by the affordances of, as you said, the vocabulary of AR, VR, or advanced virtuality, right?
Right, it's a great point, yes. So research by others in this field and ourselves, we've shown that what happens in the virtual experience, we shouldn't think about that as somehow separate from our real lives. People like to have this dichotomy of the virtual and the real. I very often say physical world and virtual just for that reason, because if people have a negative experience online, like a bullying, you don't want to say, well, that was just a virtual experience. But if you have a learning experience, then you don't want to say, oh, well, that has no transfer to their physical world lives. And so there's research, such as our studies of virtual identities, where we've shown that people's performance, that their learning, their physical world engagement, how they feel about the subject matter, actually changes from the virtual experience. There's other research that shows that if you, for example, use an avatar with some physical difference, or you do an altruistic behavior within a virtual space, afterwards you have greater disposition to engage in that altruistic, helpful behavior afterwards. So sometimes people ask, and they feel a little anxiety. Are virtual experiences just cutting people off from the physical world? Can we just lose ourselves in this space? We're actually interested in the kind of research that pushes people out to the physical world so that you have that transfer, you have that transfer of confidence. You see yourself differently in the physical world afterwards. It doesn't just remain within the virtual.
It's fascinating. In some ways, before virtuality, we had drills and simulations, right? And we've used that to train people. So when they face the real world, they know how to prepare. And now you can do this at scale. You can do it in a much more adaptive way. Everyone can have sort of their own coach, and then all these other affordances that we didn't have earlier. Talk a little bit about the workplace. Imagine, for example, one young person from Iowa grew up on a farm, really comfortable with equipment. Another one who comes from Manhattan, never worked on a machine, feels intimidated, right? Or, I mean, that's just one example, right? But just where could this go in the workplace?
Sure. Well, so thinking about this in terms of workplace learning touches on one of my favorite subdisciplines in computer science, which is computer-supported cooperative work. This is where people address socio-technical issues, as they put it. Not only if you make the system more efficient or user-friendly, is it more successful, but how do you address the social conditions of use, and collaboration is one of the major ones. So if you want to build bridges between people collaborating in the workplace, you need to know, for example, who else is there? How do you mitigate the way that you're communicating with them, for instance? How do you handle conflict? And using these kind of technologies is a kind of place where you can actually play through these kind of issues. And some of my students are very interested in games engineering. In the realm of video games, there's a term they use called the magic circle. And the magic circle is where you have a space separate than this physical world space and everyday life, where the stakes are high. This magic circle is a space where you can try something over and over again. You can try different strategies. You can make mistakes. You can try in playful ways. And I think that's one thing that these kind of technologies can allow is low stakes learning. That is, if you're doing, and so you mentioned simulation before, you can simulate not only the technical learning, which is crucial for the workplace, but how to work in teams, how to leverage the abilities of different people within the teams. That's, I think, one of the kind of crucial advantages for these kind of technologies within the workplace. And then finally, it shouldn't always have to be you put on the headset or you see augmented reality. We built systems that, for example, look like an email system, aestheticized a bit, but tells a story over this. Actually, there's a term for this. Epistolary narrative is the term. These are stories like Dracula told as a series of journal entries, and we can tell stories through email. That is, some people use the term gamify, but can we, you could say, storyfy experiences within the workplace using these kind of technologies? I think that just makes it so much more engaging for workplace learners and collaborators.
What's the future? Where is the CAV going to go? I mean, you have 3 remarkable projects that you showed, and there are other projects in between that I know about. What's a Polestar?
Sure, I think it's a great question. I mean, first, there's just the fundamentals of developing the center. So building up our infrastructure. We have top quality producers of the work, but building up the staff so that we have in-house developers, designers, and so forth. So I think that's one, so that students can come work with us and learn about the entire pipeline of production. So I think that's just building up. I mean, the space, we have some space that's accessible, but it's undeveloped yet. So making that kind of space a top-tier space for production. I mean, that's basically building up the kind of infrastructure to support the entire campus and other constituencies more globally. That's one. But in terms of content, in terms of research, I think pushing forward a few initiatives. So the Virtual Truth Project, that is one. Using AI technologies to combat misinformation. A lot of times people think about it as digital forensics. That's, can you identify misinformation-based computing technologies?
Like the Google, Microsoft challenge that just went out on deepfakes.
Right, can you discern using computational methods if something is or is not a deepfake? There's also verification, right? That's a kind of security-based approach. but creating more awareness and cultivating knowledge amongst users. I mean, that's one major side. We need to make all of those different aims work hand in hand. There's also the side, we call it the narrative, orality, and improvisation research project. That is, can we use this as a form so that people can tell stories in ways like we might in more improvisationally, the way that we might in everyday life, telling a story of personal experience that could inspire someone to want to achieve and so forth. So the technologies, we built narrative platforms in the past, just pushing those to make them more accessible, building compelling works. And then finally, we aim to create flagship works, again, that will be published in the top conferences of AAAI, the major AI conference, of the ACM, computer-human interaction, but at the same time, that hit the public, that hit learners, that hit users in ways that are compelling. And this, it's only been one semester, but these two projects I mentioned just recently both caught the popular imagination in the press. So I think doing works that hit on all those points going forward is a crucial aim with what we're doing.
Who will produce, so I think what you're doing here is advancing sort of the fundamentals, right, of virtuality, which is bigger than just virtual reality, which is bigger than just an Oculus Rift. So who will produce the 3D machine tool operation thing? Is that something that the CNC Milling Machine Association of America will produce? Actually, it's the SME, the Society of Manufacturing Engineers. Is that how it'll work out? How does this space play out?
Yeah, so we're constantly canvassing for different technologies that can push what we are doing, because again, although the hardware is one component, and I sit on the thesis committees of PhD students that are focused on hardware and physical spaces and so forth, but for me it's really that hardware-software integration. That is, we see some new AI approach that can say, customize a story or generate new content or generate plot points, and then we see a new technology for creating compelling graphical imagery, and then we invent a new technology which is an underlying system that models learning around a particular model, like perspective transformation. Putting all of those pieces together, I think, is what's necessary to really advance this work. And also, I think it's an important question, an observation that you have when you say, when you're looking at kind of like what the future of this is as a medium out there in the world. Because although we have projects that hit on a lot of different themes, it might sound as if we have truth and we have identity and so forth. Again, we're interested in the fundamentals. That is, how can we create simulations, the underlying experience? Those are a particular set of AI techniques for immersive engagement that we've been focused on. We're interested in the learning. Can we measure what happens? And we look at learning in a broadly construed kind of way, that is in dialogue with a system, in dialogue with models coming from the learning sciences and cognitive sciences, and then merge those to have compelling experiences that are also engaging. So if you think about that adaptive software piece, the AI technologies piece, the learning sciences, cognition piece, and then the expressive piece, then we have a very focused mission in terms of bringing these areas together. And that's, I think, a unique hallmark of what we are doing. So we're constantly canvassing for what's out there, but we're also laser focused in terms of how we can bring these three areas together to really pioneer this as a medium which is as compelling as other media were before it.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'll give you a couple of minutes, because I'm going to answer a question that was asked of me, which is, if you had to take a history course and redesign it using these new affordances, pick a course and what would you do, right? American history or something. But I'll give you a minute to think about it. There was a question for me, which is, what's next on open learning's horizon in nurturing creativity in learning? Look, my philosophical view of this is that the human being is uniquely a learning animal and a creative animal. We have cats in our house, kittens. We got them as kittens. They were abandoned. They know how to hunt. Why? Because they were hardwired. But the human being is soft-wired. In other words, we spend 15, 20, in my case, 50 plus years still growing up and learning. And We do that because we can be creative and adapt to our environment. So we can live in Siberia, we can live in the Sahara, we can live in a tropical rainforest or in a temperate area, and we can do all these things. So to displace, I think classrooms have been taken over by one-to-many lectures. And if there is one thing we want to do, it is to displace that lecture time to the online, make it as immersive as possible, make it as close to reality as possible, but to use the real time to do creative stuff, work on curiosity, experimentation, expression. And so for me, creativity is the essence of what we're trying to do. We're trying to create room for our students to be creative. In fact, MIT has a long history of doing this. A lot of the robotics contests in the world come from an MIT class called 2007. It was created by a dear colleague of mine, Woody Flowers, who passed away a month and a half ago, much to our utter, we were completely bereaved by that and shocked. Scratch is an MIT thing. First robotics came out of that MIT class, and so on. I could go on and on, but it's all about the creativity. And that's really our focus. So back to you, Fox. I put you on the spot there, and I gave you a couple of minutes.
All right, thanks. So I actually like this question quite a bit, because I think about it a lot. I'm really good friends with a person that directs the history design studio at Harvard, and so he's constantly asking me these kind of questions. How can we leverage these new technologies for history education? So I'll say two things. One is simulation. So we look for any phenomenon that has systematicity to it. So when you learn about the feudal system, you learn about what are the kind of access, the kind of economics that exist within the system, the resources and issues like disease and so forth. So anything like that we can simulate. And students are already used to this kind of experience through whether it's games like SimCity and other kind of simulation games. But the other part we can do besides simulate is humanize. It is so you can see yourself and find a role within that kind of experience. So a lot of times these simulations feel like information graphics. That is, I've seen a very robust and moving, in some ways, simulation from the New York Times. This was about genocide, loss of life. You got a strong sense of scale. But what's lost when you have dots that represent each individual is that human side. So if we can both simulate that kind of systematicity of these kind of experiences, but then also humanize so that you see yourself within that kind of experience, I think that's quite powerful. So I have a 8-year-old son myself, and when choosing his school, one of the things that stood out to me was a school where they mentioned the genocide of Native Americans here, even for kids that were about the 5th grade level, just meeting with teachers. And they said that when they teach this, they tell the students to focus on the flames that existed, not the ashes. So not only the kind of negatives, that is, but what were those important, crucial moments that were also hopeful in some kind of sense and powerful. And I think about my own experience in the way that I didn't have that. When I learned about US history or European history, for instance, and I had to think, I loved reading fantasy books or Ivanhoe and these kind of stories, but then when it came time to visualize myself, there was no one that looked like me at all within these kind of books. And when it came to US history of African American people in the United States, it was just people in threadbare clothes wearing collars and that whole history of transatlantic European slave trade. So if instead you could say, who is this person who's learning about this history? Can we see yourself as having agency? What were the things you could have done? Who could you have worked with? You could have worked with Cambridge area abolitionists or others. It's just to learn about all of that kind of agency within that kind of space in a way that's personalized. That would have been so transformative, to be able to see myself in a way that was deeply empowering. In some way, that's one aspect of this work that I feel like even for my own child that I'm trying to be able to pass on. So I think it's really a great question because it's a new set of possibilities for teaching history in a way that you don't have those kind of negatives for avid learners like me that could have just pushed me out to make me see separate and not a part of that history. I think I was able to push past it, but that's in spite of, not because of being inspired by the kind of way we're learning history.
So that's really inspiring. And history is a topic where you can really bring things to life using these modalities. How about something a little bit more utilitarian, like math?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm a person that thinks that history is utilitarian as well as expressive or humanistic, and likewise for math too. I mean, I think there's great creativity in computer programming, but I take the spirit of the question as well. I think, again, with the kind of work that we were doing in classrooms, that was teaching students core concepts. They learn breadth first search, depth first search, human-computer interaction, basics of web design, and issues of privacy. So they would learn all of these kind of issues. Actually, we partnered with Exploring Computer Science. I think it's a great national curriculum. We actually got a letter vetting our system saying that we uphold all of the kind of values and structures that they do. So I think doing the kind of work where you're learning computer science, learning the core content, but then pushing it for the topics that you care about. So it's not only, I actually think people go the farthest when they're doing the kind of work that they care about the most. That's what I tell my PhD students. So when students are learning computer science, even for utilitarian aims, like to get a job afterwards, they'll learn it more robustly if they can see that it can make a difference in their lives, in their communities, in their society. And I think that's just the way that education is changing more broadly. A lot of my own students here at MIT, they want to not just learn the subject matter, they want to say, how can I learn it in order to make a better world, a better society? I actually think that that's crucial. The utilitarian side is just pushed forward when you also engage that side of how it connects to your deeper life aspirations.
Yeah, it's very inspiring. Actually, Maria Clave, who's a college president, did some work on making computer science accessible by making it relevant. And there's this whole area of research, as you know, called situated cognition, right? Where you situate the research in an area that's relevant to the learner as opposed to irrelevant, which then creates all these obstacles that we talked about. Jean Lavey talks about, teaching fruit sellers. If you teach them math, then put in the context of fruit as opposed to in the context of something completely irrelevant, right? Ice or something, right? This is wonderful. Well, any last words before we wrap up? In the following sense, do you think that this whole open movement, right, and online movement, do you see them as in the future making a significant impact on education and therefore on society?
I think it's crucial. So I think that this aim within open learning of using immersive technologies for teaching, going beyond distance learning, and thinking about the richest pedagogy, how people learn, as you mentioned, embodied, distributed cognition, situated cognition, not just that everything that happens is in the mind, but what happens is social. It involves the tools and technologies that we use, and it's embodied. That is, it should impact the physical world and be based on how we learn in the physical world. I think that is just so crucially important, and I actually think that it's a kind of revolution in terms of democratizing access, but not just democratizing access. That is to a kind of older style of learning. It's democratizing access and then revolutionizing the way that people can learn too, so that it's both inspiring, so that it sticks, so that it's transforming and pushes people to go further and further in a way that, again, they see themselves as powerful learners and doers of the subject matter. So I think it's just crucial. That's what's made it fun and busy and important and engaging to be pushing forward the Center for Advanced Virtuality within open learning.
Well, this is fantastic. Thank you, Fox. I'd like to thank our donors and sponsors and supporters. I hope you've been as captivated as I've been. I have about 30 other questions. I've still got to ask you about Lil Nas, who I'm a huge fan of. Can't get that song out of my head. But thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.